ID. A digital ID is a digital representation of a person, which can be used to verify who they are or certain facts about them, including age, nationality, right to work, in online and in physical interactions. Digital identities can be issued by a government or they can be done by private companies. It depends on the context. Um, Proving who you are is such a constant part of modern life in a modern state, and digital ID can be used for a really wide range of purposes. It can be used to make the user's life easier by giving them a way to prove who they are or something about themselves. For example, like they're over the age of 18. Or it can be a way to create a very detailed picture of someone by connecting all of their data from individual interactions with the state. So the devil is very much in the detail of how the UK government is proposing to build the system. So, what do we know so far? On the eve of Labour conference, Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that the government would introduce digital ID by the time they call the next election. Starmer announced that every working adult in the UK will need a digital ID to prove their right to work, so it will be mandatory for working people. Since that announcement, the government has been expanding the scope of what digital ID could do in their statements to Parliament, the media, and via their slightly unusual social media explainer videos. In Parliament last month, Secretary of State for Technology, Liz Kendall, focused on making a very much public services, focused on making public services more efficient via a digital ID system by linking up state databases to try and stop people from being passed from service to service or having to prove that they have the right to access something again and again. This project is a priority for the Prime Minister. It has been moved from the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology into the Cabinet Office and is being overseen by the Prime Minister's current right-hand man, Darren Jones. And the government has promised a consultation on their proposals, which will arrive before Christmas, which is a nice present for us all to look forward to. So, how did we get here? A brief history of the Digital ID campaign. Um, you're all Liberty supporters. You know that we've very much been here before. In 2002, Home Secretary David Blunkett announced plans for a national identity card, the first time the UK had had such a identity document since wartime when they were abandoned in the 50s. Just as now it has been cited as a way to fix many different difficult problems for the state. When David Blunkett introduced it, it was cited as a way to combat terrorism after 9/11, benefit fraud, and illegal working. New Labour also wanted to include biometric data, including fingerprints and iris recognition. So it actually went quite a bit further than the current government is thinking about. So in response, the No to ID campaign was launched, which Liberty was a leading member of. No to ID opposed the introduction of IDs linked to a centralized database. At the height of the campaign, it had around 30,000 supporters and around 100 organizational affiliates. It was really exciting, and we're hoping to meet this current proposal with the same amount of energy and passion. ID cards became law in 2006, but the Labour government had conceded, and we campaigned so effectively that they decided not to make them mandatory. Um, by 2010, around 15,000 ID cards had been issued. Then the coalition government won that election and immediately scrapped the scheme. So in total, it was estimated to have cost £4.6 billion. But eventually, we won that campaign. Well, what has happened since? Nothing lasts forever. Since Labour looked like it would come back to power in 2023, various Labour-affiliated think tanks have been pushing for the party to introduce digital ID, the 2025 update of the original New Labour proposal. These groups did include the Tony Blair Institute and Labour Together, which is another Labour-affiliated think tank. These groups have suggested digital ID could be used for everything from stopping the boats to fixing potholes. It's another silver bullet solution to lots of state problems. In April 2025, three pressure groups of backbench MPs, including the Labour Growth Group, the Red Wall Group, and Blue Labour, joined together to write a letter advocating for digital ID's introduction to control migration and improve public services. Whilst former Home Secretary Yvette Cooper denied again and again that the Labour government would bring in digital ID, they surprised us all. before Labour conference and announced it. It has since emerged that various government departments had been getting ready for their announcement secretly for months. So we have a lot of work to do. What are the risks? This is what Liberty will be focusing on preventing. There are many risks in bringing a digital ID system that Liberty is concerned about, and we will be campaigning to make sure the government does not trample over our human rights in the rush to maximize government efficiency. So these are the four main things that we're concerned about right now. We do not want a mandatory digital ID system. We are very concerned that any mandatory digital ID system will, if participation in such a system is compulsory, we lose all our ability to meaningfully consent to how our identity and personal data is collected, stored, and used. Whilst the government has tried to argue that it won't be mandatory, any system that requires everyone who works to have a digital ID is de facto compulsory for the majority of the population. They've already tried to pitch a digital ID system as giving us back our control over how our data is used, but in reality, any system that's used for enforcement will remove our choice. And this brings us to the second problem. We think it will be exclusionary. A mandatory system will make our second concern, exclusion, even worse. A mandatory digital ID system will create even more barriers to work and other services than already exist. We're very concerned about the impact of this policy on people who are digitally excluded. The Digital Poverty Alliance has found between 13 and 19 million people over 16 in the UK live with some kind of digital poverty, meaning they find having a personal usable device and a reliable and secure internet connection is not affordable. Putting up barriers for these people to get into the workforce could be really harmful. The government has already suggested giving digitally excluded people physical ID cards instead, but Liberty is concerned that this is not a reliable way to reduce exclusion. The previous government's research conducted ahead of the voter ID introduction found that those with severely limiting disabilities, the unemployed, people without qualifications, and those who had never voted before were all less likely to hold any form of photo ID. So we're very concerned about the erection of these barriers to people accessing the workforce and potentially public services in the future. Our third concern is surveillance. If a digital ID system is built badly and without proper human rights safeguards, it could become a really effective machine for surveillance. A digital ID system could create a single unique identifier for each of us. If this is used to connect previously unconnected information from disparate databases like our health information, education, criminal history, sexuality, political affiliations, the list goes on, then the government could build a very detailed picture of our lives and build profiles of our behavior, preferences, beliefs, associations, etc. Such profiling could lead to discrimination and targeting of specific groups, and it would be deeply susceptible to mission creep, where a system introduced for one purpose could gradually be adapted for others. For example, the Labour Together digital ID paper suggests using the National Landlord Database, which was designed to protect tenants from rogue landlords, be used to also conduct right to rent checks. So once this infrastructure exists, the rules can be expanded without needing to rebuild the entire system. That is why we will be looking really carefully at the detail of what the government proposes to build to ensure it cannot be used to surveil us all. And then finally, data security. There is a significant cybersecurity risk in building a digital ID system, and we are really concerned about the government's dire record on building safe digital infrastructure. For example, cybersecurity experts have warned that the gov.uk ID wallet may pose a significant data security risk. The Government Digital Service was warned by the Cabinet Office in 2022 and the National Cybersecurity Centre in September 2023 that its one login system had serious data protection failings and significant shortcomings in information security that could lead to the risks of data breaches and identity theft. The One Login team has yet to fully meet the national security guidelines and to fully implement the government's secure by design practices as of May this year. If an ID database is hacked or compromised, as they have been in many other countries like India and Estonia, our most sensitive data could be leaked and lead to identity theft and fraud. In an age where cyber warfare is becoming increasingly prevalent and serious, having offline alternatives to digital systems has never been more important. This is an important question. Are there any benefits? Is there anything behind the government's proposals? So, potentially, but only if the government goes in a very different direction to what it has announced so far. Sometimes I think it can be helpful in evaluating a digital system to look critically at the analog alternatives. Right now, if we want to prove our right to work, we need to send our estate or our right to work or to rent, we need to send our estate agent or our employer a photo of our passport or some other identity document, which contains a lot of sensitive information irrelevant to the check at hand, that they need to do. And that will often sit in a file somewhere on a system which is relatively badly protected. If the government did decide to strictly focus on building a system that improves our privacy protections, they could build a decentralized system using world-class encryption to allow us to securely prove who we are or that we have the right to access a good or service. But given that the government seems dead set on creating a system that will expand the hostile environment and could lead to surveillance or difficult data security problems, it feels unlikely that they will build a digital system focused on improving the public good or protecting our liberties. So, amidst all this, what is Liberty's stance? We absolutely oppose mandatory digital ID, and we are concerned about the risks that a digital ID system could pose to our privacy rights and the most marginalized members of our society. Whilst we do not, in principle, oppose every digital ID system, the devil is in the detail, and the government's announcements so far are very much not promising. So we will be scrutinizing the government's proposals very carefully, using our human rights principles and values. What are the next steps? The government will be announcing the specifics of their plans and putting them out to consultation sometime before Christmas. Liberty will be ready to scrutinize them very carefully. And if we find they will harm our human rights and civil liberties, we will campaign to put a stop to that system. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you so much, Anna, for taking us through that. That was brilliant. So we now have plenty of time for questions. I want to say a massive thank you so much to everyone who sent questions in advance. We have lots to get through, as well as I can see people popping them into the Q&A box as well, which is fantastic. So keep on doing that, and we'll try and get back to as many as we can today. So, Anna, a few questions that have been sent here in advance. I'll keep these ones anonymous, and then I'll read out the ones in the Q&A box as well. So we have one here that was sent in. How will it work for people who do not have internet access or access to smartphones?
Yeah, so this is probably our main concern, or one of our main concerns about the government's proposals. Making a system mandatory means that there will inevitably be people who are excluded from that. And those people are the people who don't have a smartphone, who do not have easy access to the internet. The government has suggested, like I said, a physical alternative, like a card of some sort. Um, as I mentioned, that is very difficult for those marginalized people, those vulnerable people to access as it stands. So we are concerned that that won't be an adequate safeguard. And we will be looking in detail at what the government suggests doing. We know that they're very concerned about the exclusion risks, and that will be something that we spend a lot of time campaigning on.
Thank you so much. On to the next question here. Well, you spoke a little bit about the benefits already, or lack of perhaps. One of the questions is here, how is this supposed to benefit British people at all?
This is going to be something that we look at when the government decides exactly what they're going to do. I think the devil, again, is in the detail of what they propose. We do not think that this will be an effective way to reduce irregular migration. It will just be another right to work check that rogue employers do not look at, and it will further marginalize and exclude irregular migrants from our society. The hostile environment has not worked. Lots of evidence has shown that, including the there was a independent review of the hostile environment policies, and it found that it hadn't reduced irregular migration. And this is just another attempt to do the same thing that has already failed. So we will be looking to see if there is any benefit to the British people for having a digital ID, and if those benefits outweigh the risks, then we could potentially support it. But we just don't think that is going to happen, seeing what the government has announced so far.
Okay, thank you. The questions are coming in thick and fast. Thank you so much, everyone, for sending these in. We have one that's come in from today, from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for sending in your question. This question is, can GDPR legislation be used? Oh, sorry, it's going so quickly. Can GDPR legislation be used to stall or prevent the introduction of single digital ID?
So this is a really interesting question. We are concerned that digital ID will radically undermine GDPR. Um, as you may or may not know, GDPR means that information collected can only be used for a limited and specific purpose. And if a government digital ID system links all of those different bits of information into one huge picture of you, that is a real surveillance risk. Obviously, the government can always legislate to undermine GDPR in order to forward a policy proposal. They did that very thing earlier this year in the Data Use and Access Bill, which did undermine our GDPR protections for automated decision making. So they have a lot of power in their parliamentary sovereignty, and we will be campaigning to make sure that they don't water down our hard-won privacy protections. They're really important.
Thank you so much. On to the next one. This is another one in the room. We've got one from Byron here that says, great lecture. Thank you, Anna. Do you think there is a possibility of it creating a black market economy? And why is no one talking about that seriously?
So that's really interesting. The black market economy already exists. We would say that the UK has like a relatively small black market economy across, if you compare us to Europe or other developed nations. We have about 5% of our GDP is an underground economy. If you compare that to Estonia, which has a digital ID system, they have about 7%. Germany has about 6% or something. So we have a relatively small underground economy already. We just don't think that digital ID will have any further impact on the size of that economy, because if a rogue employer wants to, take advantage of irregular migrants and exploit them, this won't do anything to stop that. And it won't stop anyone working under the table, which is how most irregular work is done. So we would like to see the government's analysis of how this is going to make the underground economy smaller than it is. And we will be scrutinizing it very carefully.
Thank you, Anna, and also thank you for that great question. We've got some more in here for you. Let me see, which one should we go for? Well, this actually is a great one, and a little you spoke to it at the end of your presentation. An anonymous viewer is asking, what is the end result Liberty is trying to achieve? Is it stopping the digital ID altogether, or trying to resolve some of the issues around its implementation, or, around privacy and exclusion of certain members? Yeah, I think they just want to hear more about Liberty's stance.
Yeah, so this is a good question. I guess it's quite nuanced. It kind of depends what the government decides to do. If the government proposes something that is just going to be really dangerous for our human rights and looks like it could be really easily used by a future government to surveil us all, or the rules could be changed and the data they collect could be expanded very easily, that kind of thing, we will campaign to make sure that system is never implemented, is never brought to bear. If they do take our advice, civil society's advice, and build a more privacy protective digital ID system, there may be a way for us to work together to implement something that's safe, but the signs are not looking good. It looks like we will probably be campaigning to stop digital ID, but we don't want to preempt what the government announces. If it's surprisingly good, then maybe our stance will change.
Okay, yeah. A lot of it we'll have to wait and see and just keep you all updated as well in your inbox. We've got one here from Ed Bridges, who's in the room today. The question is, how are the UK government getting away with claiming the scheme is voluntary when anyone who works will need one? What sanctions await those who refuse?
Yeah, this is something that is really concerning to us. It does feel like the government is being borderline dishonest about this particular factor. I think they recognize that mandatory digital ID is a very unpopular policy. And that whilst lots of people have said that they would like easier access to services or that kind of thing, people don't want mandatory digital ID. So they're trying to do a bit of sophistry to say that this is actually a voluntary scheme. Now, if it is mandatory in order to access the workplace, that is mandatory for most of the population. And we will be all over the media trying to make that point, and trying to hold the government accountable so that they can be honest about what the scheme actually does.
Thank you. A couple more that have come in the room today, and thank you again. Keep on sending your questions. We've got plenty of time. We've got one here from Nathan, who asks, how many of these risks apply to existing schemes, such as the gov.uk one login?
So a lot of these do apply to the existing schemes, and that's why we're going to be scrutinizing how they've worked really carefully. So for something that we've been looking at very carefully is the e-visa scheme, which is digital ID for migrants. And the rollout of that system has been absolutely awful. It's excluded a bunch of people who didn't have the right paperwork, or they didn't have digital access, so they didn't see the advertisements, or they weren't able to have the right thing for the right time. So I think when the e-visa deadline hit, there were about 700,000 people who still didn't have their e-visa approved, and the system has crashed many times. There's been inaccurate data involved in people's records. So we're very much looking at the existing digital infrastructure that the government will be, rolling out to the rest of the population and seeing if it works well, what human rights risks already exist in it. And what we're seeing so far is not promising. As I said, the one login system and the gov.uk wallet have had consistent data security failings. So it's all a bit concerning, and it is all relevant to the digital ID plan, and we will be looking at it all very carefully.
Speaking of, we actually have had a question come in asking if we'll do another one of these events once the plans have been published, which I know we haven't discussed behind the scenes, but that's something definitely to think about. Once we have much more information from the government proposals, I think it could be great.
Yeah, I mean, as I've had to keep saying, the detail of what the government announces is the most important thing, and that's really where the human rights risks hide. So, yes, we will come back to you with more in the future, I'm sure.
Amazing. I'm sure people will be happy to hear that. So I've got one here which was submitted before this event. It's a really interesting one. And so this one is, how do we separate fact from fiction when there's such a large vacuum of misinformation online relating to digital ID? It can be very confusing. It can cause a great deal of anger and anxiety. And I'm sure a lot of people can resonate with that one.
Yeah, it's something that we've been thinking about a lot too, because I mean, the human rights risks are very real, and it is hard when the government has not announced exactly what it's going to do. It feels like it creates a vacuum where some bad actors, some people who are genuinely concerned are kind of, you know, slightly panicking about what it could be. Um, there is a bit of a slippery slope argument here. Like if we create this infrastructure, then Big Brother will be watching us. But the surveillance risk is very real. So I think it's going to be Liberty's job and organizations like Liberty to explain what is fact and what is fiction once the government announces what it's going to do, and to help people understand, okay, this is the real risk and this is misinformation, and how can we campaign together to make sure that the real risks are addressed. But in an information environment like the one we have now that's so fragmented and so polarized, it is a really dangerous moment for the government to be creating a vacuum of information. Like if we don't know what they're going to do, people will speculate.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I will just say to everyone on this call, please do keep an eye on your inbox. We'll keep you updated as much as we can as soon as we know any more information as well. On to some more questions. So we've got one here, another anonymous question. You mentioned that a digital ID will give us all a unique identifier. Do not the majority of us already have such unique identifiers, such as national insurance numbers? Yeah, that's their question. Yeah, do we not already have this? Is it necessary?
Yeah. So it's not that a digital ID will give us a unique identifier, it's that it could give us a unique identifier, and it would be bad if it did. We do all have unique identifiers as it stands. We all, as you say, have national insurance numbers, but they're not used as an identifier for us across the state. They're used in some situations, but our NHS number is different from our national insurance number. Or is it? Yeah, that is correct. There are various different kinds of identifiers we have, and if there is one single one, it will allow the government to create this much more comprehensive picture of us than already exists and allow them to profile us across lots of more databases than they have access to now, which will give them a 360 view of us across the state. We are concerned about the amount of power that gives the government.
Thank you so much. And thank you for allowing us to just pick your brains on all of this. We've got some more questions here. One from Kevin Walters. Thank you for your question, Kevin. Kevin's question is: does Liberty have a view on the funding the system? So, does Liberty have a view on whether it's taxpayer funded versus unsubsidized charging of cost to each voluntary ID card user?
Well, I mean, the government hasn't suggested how it will fund it. I think it like as it stands, it will probably be funded by the taxpayer. Um, the estimates that have been circulating in the media so far from the main one that I've seen is the one that was put forward by Labour Together, which was 140 million to 400 million of taxpayer money. They want the system to be built in-house by the government. Um, we do think that is a massive underestimation of how expensive it will be on the taxpayer to build the system. And that is something that we will be very carefully scrutinizing. The cost of this will be a really important political factor. It ended up being the thing that toppled the last ID system in the 2000s. In 2010, we won the argument with the coalition government by saying it was just too expensive to run. So that will be a key factor in the political fight. But how it will be funded, they haven't announced yet, but if I had to wager my money, it would be taxpayer.
Okay, yeah, thank you. We have another anonymous question here. Let me just read this one out. We have: how can we make the case to lawmakers that if this is to be done, it must be done in a decentralized fashion with technical and cryptographic enforcement of limits on the ways it can be used? Very technical question coming in there.
A technical question and very much speaking my language, that is exactly what we've been thinking. Um, it's interesting, the government has very much tied this scheme to Keir Starmer himself. I think it's been really interesting that Keir is the one who's been doing a lot of press about it, that has been doing online videos about it, that it was moved into his office under Darren Jones. Like, this is very much a Keir Starmer policy. And that's definitely helping to frame our thinking about it at Liberty. As long as Keir Starmer is Prime Minister, it feels like this digital ID system will be rolled out, it will be legislated for, and it probably will be passed. And therefore, is there a way that we can tell the government that it could make it more, that could make it safer than what they've proposed? A decentralized cryptographic system where the data is held locally on your phone is probably the best possible way this can be done. And it has been done successfully in various countries around the world. We would really encourage the government to look how it has been done well. And that kind of system might even have some benefits for our privacy. Like I said in the presentation, it might mean that we have to share less information with people than we currently do. So that could be good. But whether the government is capable of building a safe, privacy protective system and whether they're able to see that that is the right thing to do, we will see.
We will definitely see. Thank you again for your question and for your answer, Anna. We've got some more anonymous questions that have been sent in. previously to this event. This question is, considering the amount of poverty and poverty impacting children in particular in the United Kingdom, how can this scheme be considered remotely an ethical use of public money?
Yeah, yeah, that is a really good point. And given that it probably will cost more than the current estimates put forward by think tanks, I think that's particularly pertinent. The last system cost 4.6 billion, according to the Institute for Government. So that, I mean, that is a lot of public money that could be going towards reducing child poverty, one of Labour's supposed central aims. And that's particularly concerning if that system reproduces or produces even more exclusionary barriers for the most vulnerable members of our society, for the most impoverished people. So it's not only the costs, but the cascading effects of such a system on those people. So it's definitely something that we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at and making sure that the government understands the impact that it could have on the most marginalized people in our society.
Thank you so much. And we've got another question here, which is a little bit more about Liberty's work and how we do work as an organization. They're asking if we're working with any other organizations that are concerned about privacy and freedoms that we're working with.
Absolutely. We are an organization that works really closely with lots of other civil society organizations, but also tech organizations and grassroots organizations. And this campaign will require a ton of energy and expertise and passion, just like the last campaign did. In the 2000s, we worked with 100 organizations as part of the No to ID coalition, and we're hoping we'll have such a great uptake again. I think it will be really important to kind of band together. And we are spending time not only with other civil liberties and tech-focused charities, but also organizations that represent the kind of people who will be excluded by this system and who have particular interest in making sure it's safe for their communities, like migrants' rights charities. And we're particularly interested in working with digital exclusion charities. So we're doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that the coalition is up and running by the time that the government consultation comes out.
Thank you so much. The questions are continuing to come in, which is brilliant. Keep on sending them in. We've got lots of time. Um, One question here, which was sent in advance, another anonymous one, is will Liberty be addressing concerns around the introduction of a children's digital ID as is being attempted to be rolled out as part of the Children's Welfare in Schools Bill? This supporter is deeply concerned about this and the safety of their child's data.
Yeah, this is a really important point and quite a technical one, but I'm really glad it was raised. We are working in coalition with other organizations who've been campaigning on this for a long time. It's kind of it's kind of a test balloon or a potential like guinea pig test of a digital ID system, much like the e-visa was for migrants. And we are deeply concerned about the implications it could have for children. So we will definitely be looking at it. And I think that bill is in the Lords right now, and we will be working with other organizations who are leading the charge on that one. Liberty is not specifically leading the work on this. Digital Defend Me has done some amazing work on this. Really recommend that you look at their work if you haven't already, but we will definitely be supporting the work that's already being done and looking very carefully at what it will mean for children and for us all.
Thank you so much, and thank you to that supporter for your question as well. So we've got one here about Labour. What's your take on the internal Labour argument? How many Labour MPs might be persuaded to resist this at all, and what arguments are working with them?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's obviously very difficult to get any campaign ask through a government that has such a huge majority, can kind of just push its legislative agenda through through Parliament, through the Commons, if it really wants to. Um, which is why we're trying to be a bit more savvy, a bit more strategic. I think it has been interesting, as I said earlier, that the government has tied this so directly to Keir himself. I don't think that bodes particularly well for us in defeating it just in an up-down vote. in the Commons, because it will be a referendum on the party's view of Keir. I mean, that could be good, that could be bad, depending on what happens in politics. You never know. So we're trying to, as much as possible, like convince the government that it's a bad idea to, introduce a system that's extremely exclusionary, that has so many privacy risks. And then if it comes down to it, it will be a challenging parliamentary fight, but one that we will definitely take on with the help of all the coalition of organizations that we're working with. But as constructive as we can be before it hits Parliament, that will probably be more fruitful. Um, I think the things that particularly appeal to Labour MPs so far are the exclusion point. That's a really big problem for lots of Labour MPs. You know, I think it was interesting that Meg Hillier, who led the Welfare Rebellion in the Commons, has already been voicing her concerns about how this could affect the most marginalized people in society. That's definitely something that we will be supporting. Um, Costs and data security, that's another one that has a lot of cut through because the hacks that have happened in the summer in the news all the time, Jaguar Land Rover, M&S Co-op, it's always in the news, and there have been some very serious government database hacks in the past year, including the Legal Aid Agency that has absolutely crippled the justice system even more than it already was. So that's another really salient point so far. Um, but we will be continuing to find the salient arguments and trying as much as possible to influence the what digital ID looks like before it comes to a parliamentary vote.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for your questions. We've got plenty more coming in here. We have one here from Francis, who has said, I'm retired and against mandatory ID, but what about accessing services if I don't have a card? And I imagine, we don't know the government's plans, but if you have anything to add on there.
Yeah, absolutely. So thankfully for you, it does not seem like the government plans to make digital ID mandatory to access services, which is definitely a really good thing. And if it did, we would campaign to make sure that that wasn't the case. Um, they have spoken a lot about service access, and it seems like in that circumstance, it will be optional for people who will find it easier to have a digital ID than to be in person. But, it's we will always campaign for a right to access services without any form of digital ID. It's absolutely essential that people do not face more barriers to accessing essential services than they already do. And as I just mentioned with the hacks, in a geopolitically hostile environment where cyber warfare is increasingly, prevalent and increasingly successful, it's really important that the government maintains offline alternatives so that if a digital system goes down, the harm to individuals and to users of that service is minimized. The government always needs an option. What happens if the digital ID system is, attacked? What will happen to all the people who rely on it? So an offline alternative is absolutely essential as a safeguard there.
Thank you so much. We hope that answers your question well, Francis. On to the next question here. We have one from Patsy. So Patsy's question today is, oh, actually, it's not a question, but Patsy says, I'm quite concerned about how many MPs I've spoken to who are minimizing people's concerns over surveillance in general. Has Liberty or anyone else had a different experience with MPs?
Um, no, unfortunately, I would say that your experience is a common one, and it's something that I think we find very difficult to grapple with in 2025. Last time we were having this debate in the 2000s, it definitely felt like surveillance and privacy were a much more salient point that people really did care about, all their data being given away. Now MPs have an easy way to say, oh, but you give all your data away to Facebook or to Google every time you use the internet. Why should the government not benefit from the same level of efficiency and information sharing that, these big corporations are able to every day? So the argument for surveillance and privacy has become way more challenging in 2025 than it has ever been. I guess our perspective is just because we've lost a lot of ground to big tech companies doesn't mean that we should be reproducing the harms and, that the government should therefore get all the access that the companies shouldn't have anyway in the first place. And that's why these safeguards are more important than ever. But from a campaigning perspective, we've found it easier to emphasize things like the exclusion risk or the costs or the data security risk. Those have a lot more cut through with MPs than the surveillance risk, which they now associate with like conspiracy theories, even though a lot of those risks are very real. And we've seen lots of the harms created by these companies having so much information about your life. It's not good that they have all that information. And we're always campaigning or thinking about different ways that we can convince the government that that is a bad idea. But yes, surveillance policy in 2025 definitely has its challenges. It's not just you.
Thank you for answering that, and thank you so much for your question again. So I've got one more here, which is probably very difficult to answer, but I will ask it anyway. It's from Anonymous, and it's what happens if you don't succeed in achieving your goal before implementation? Do you continue fighting?
Oh, no, this is easy. Absolutely. We
Brilliant.
always keep fighting. Um, so I think, a good example of how this kind of approach works is the last time that they tried to do this, they implemented the scheme in 2006. They rolled it out. We were able to influence the way they rolled it out. They had pitched the scheme, the ID card scheme in the 2000s as mandatory initially. And along with our brilliant coalition of other organizations, we were able to convince them not to make it mandatory. So they rolled it out in an optional way. That was a big win, even though they implemented it. And then we spent the next 4 years convincing the opposition that it was really bad for privacy, that it was a really dangerous policy, that it cost too much. And then when the opposition got into government, they immediately repealed it. So implementation is never the end goal of a campaign, or that it's never the end, complete defeat. There's always more work to be done. And if these systems are implemented, we'll be looking really carefully at how that implementation is being done, making sure we're scrutinizing, okay, are the inclusion policies working? Who's being left out? And then if people are being left out, we're campaigning for those people's right to be included. So even if we lose at every post, we will keep fighting until the end.
Amazing. I love that answer. And I think that's something that we can just guarantee to everyone in the room and our supporters in general. We will continue fighting, even if we come across any other roadblocks and hindrances along the way. So we've got one here from an anonymous attendee, but who's in the room with us today. So hello and thank you for your question. Would digital IDs be used to fast track deportations, i.e. no ID equals no right to stay?
So, I mean, yeah, this depends how the government ultimately decides to roll it out. That is definitely a concern that we have. And I think it's particularly concerning given the general political environment we're in, where you have a leader of the Conservative Party committing to creating a US style of like an ICE force designed to, terrorize migrant communities. And the fact that Cami can commit to that and not see how a digital ID system could help, facilitate that kind of force. She opposes digital ID, but for privacy reasons, but wants to create this massive force. And I think we're looking at all of the different things the government is doing in the round. So, for example, facial recognition technology, their attack on encryption, their digital ID proposals and, all these things that seem quite siloed and oh, they're doing a little something here, a little something there, and seeing like the generalized risk to the most marginalized people in our society. Like if these systems were all integrated properly under, for example, a far right government, um, what would that do to migrants? What would that do to the most marginal people or people that they decide to target with those systems? Which is why we try and convince the government that these safeguards are really important, that you need to think about not just how you're going to use the technology, but how a future government could use the technology. So that's a long-winded way to say we don't know if it's going to be used to fast track deportations. It definitely could be. And if it is used for that, we will campaign to make sure that it's, you know, stopped if at all possible.
Thank you so much for your answer there, Anna. We have another one here, and they speak to what you mentioned in your presentation. They've said they're a campaigner and they've come across the argument other countries have ID card systems and it seems to work well for them, so why will it not work well in the UK? I know you did speak a little bit about that in your presentation, but would you like to expand on, other country systems that are working well and why that might not be reflected in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. It's something that we've been kind of bemused about in the government's kind of pitch role of this policy. So Keir went to India and was like, oh my God, this Indian digital ID system is so amazing. And if you look into the detail of what, the Indian digital ID system has created, it's something that the British public would never accept and would be extremely politically toxic for them to try to do. It's incredibly expansive. Digital ID is used to facilitate access to absolutely everything in India, from like voting to buying a house to getting a SIM card. It includes a picture of your face, 10 fingerprints, your irises. It's been hacked several times. People's sensitive information has ended up on the dark web for sale for very little money. So when they say, oh, it's worked well in other countries, like, has it? Like, what is the detail behind that claim? And if you look, like, lots of the human rights risks that we're concerned about have already played out in different countries. Now, that's not true in every country and every digital ID system. Um, so, it depends what kind of system the government decides to emulate. There are definitely more privacy protective ones and less. And that is the kind of thing we'll be looking at very carefully when they do announce their specific plans.
Thank you so much. And actually leading on from that, we have a question here from Ian who said, what are the EU plans on digital ID?
Yeah, so the EU plans are interesting in that you can really see the effect of good human rights campaigning on them. So they were initially pitched to be much more like the UK system that has been mentioned. Like it was going to be mandatory, it was going to be needed for access to all sorts of different kinds of services, and really effective human rights campaigning throughout the EU policy making process, narrowed the scope of what the EU digital ID did, been successfully campaigned so that it was voluntary, not mandatory. Um, it is quite it's a high level framework that countries can choose to implement in ways that are specific to their country. So it, it, there are definitely parts of the EU digital ID system that we're very interested in the government emulating. For example, the high degree of cryptography that protects the EU digital ID is something that we would definitely encourage the government to look at. The fact that it's voluntary. Um, and it does show the successes of human rights campaigning in action. Um, so the EU is probably one of the better models that the government could look at, and we will definitely be pointing them in that direction as much as possible.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Ian, for that question. It was brilliant. We have a long question here. So this one is from Ross. Ross's question is, the government already has the right to access your bank. There is a disturbing trend to talk of pensions in terms of benefits. There is no current control on facial recognition or in city cameras. There is also some concerns about the misuse of police for arresting protesters. It's hard to believe we have sleepwalked into this so quickly. Can Liberty take on all of these authoritarian fronts?
Ross, I feel your pain. I share your concerns. Um, that is what Liberty is for. That's what we do. We have a team that focuses across the whole of what you've just mentioned. We're focused on protests, we're focused on surveillance, we are concerned about all of it. Part of what we're trying to explain to the government is you have to look at this in the round, right? In a moment where democracy feels more at risk than it has in several generations, when there was a really active far-right street movement and an active far-right party, the threat to democracy is acute, and it's incumbent on the government to be digging a moat around our democratic protections, our human rights, instead of debating them away or like chipping away at them bit by bit. So part of what Liberty will be doing in the next 3 years is making sure that our democracy is safeguarded and protected as much as possible. And when we're looking at individual policy areas like this, or like the cumulative disruption proposal that Labour just announced, or the threat to the ECHR, we'll be making the case to see it in the round and say, these are all connected. Our human rights are more at risk than ever. You need to have a strategy about how to protect them instead of, chipping away at them bit by bit. So that is what Liberty was founded to do, and we will continue to do it with the generous support of members like you.
Thank you so much for that brilliant question and your answer as well, Anna. I have a question here, which you have slightly touched on, but this anonymous attendee has asked, how can we trust this government or the next to respect the human and digital rights of all citizens regarding this ineffective, discriminatory, potentially mandatory plan that could be abused by authorities? Where is our right to choose?
Yeah, so that's a really important point, and I think it's a bit galling that the government has been pitching this policy as a way for users, for people to have more control over their data, more control of the ways they interact with the state. Any system that is mandatory removes control. And if you have to share your data in order to access a workplace, that's not giving the user more control of how they interact with how their data is used. So that language about choice is definitely something that's going to be hotly contested as part of this digital ID debate and any legislative, proposal that's put in front of us. It will be really important to have organizations like Liberty, but also MPs kind of picking a hole in those government arguments. From our perspective, any system that forces users to interact with a digital ID is not going to be human rights respecting. And we completely agree that it's taking away user choice. And even if the government pretends like it's giving them more, we will be there to make sure that people know that's a lie.
Thank you so much again. We're coming up to just 5 minutes left, so please send in your questions and we'll try and make sure we can answer them if possible. And I've got another quite a long one here, so feel free to take a drink while I read this out. Um, this anonymous attendee has said, one way the government seem likely to sell the digital ID idea as more secure, even more private, is a way to do digital verification, for example, age verification when ordering alcohol, age restricted products, and things like that. How are Liberty planning to combat this sort of pitch? This supporter worries that civil liberty arguments seem a bit abstract when compared to practical benefits.
Yes, yeah, they definitely do. I think that speaks to some of the concerns I raised earlier about the salience of privacy in 2025, when it feels like our privacy is so eroded by big tech business models as it is. Um, I guess it completely depends what kind of system the government decides to bring forward. It's far-fetched, but like there is a potential digital ID system that could be used to protect our information better than it already has been, right? Like what I mentioned in my presentation, if you have a passport photo, that is the way that you check your right to work, and it's kept on, an old system, IT system in an office that's badly password protected. Your data is not safe there either. So it's about looking at what's happening right now and comparing what the government proposes and looking at which is safer and which is more human rights respecting, and then making the choice about how to campaign for or against the digital ID proposal. Now, everything that we've heard from the government suggests that they're not going to look critically at, how to protect our human rights and what is most privacy protective and building a system with privacy by design in mind. So then we will oppose a system that doesn't do that. There is a theoretical system that could be better, but The government's language suggests they're not going to do that. So to get back, sorry, tangent. To get back to your original point, the civil liberties arguments are not particularly salient. We still make them because it's really important to and to defend the right to privacy as much as possible. But tactically, we also make the exclusionary arguments, the cost arguments, the data security arguments to try and win over a wide coalition of people with different kinds of concerns, MPs who might be concerned about one thing or the other, making sure that the MPs knows all the risks and we're pitching the right risks to the right MPs whilst we're also making the human rights and the civil liberties arguments at the same time.
Thank you so much. That was a great question and a fantastic answer as well. I will just read it. We've still got so many more questions that are coming in, and we will try our best to get through as many as we can before the end of this presentation. But we'll also try and get back to you via email as well, so don't worry. So I have a question here about Keir Starmer. So Keir Starmer has insisted that a digital ID system will not be open to abuse by a future government. Is there any legal or constitutional means of making this a reality? If not, should there be opportunities for future? If not, should the opportunities for future abuse be a significant part of any campaign?
That is a very good question. It's one of the quirks of the British parliamentary system that there are basically no effective checks or balances to parliamentary sovereignty. If the government has a majority, it can kind of do whatever it wants, which is why it's very important that the government understands that if it builds the infrastructure to do this, it can be used to, surveil or spy on or do various things to future populations by future governments. So it's always important, especially if you're a former human rights lawyer as prime minister, to make sure that you're building systems with that safeguard in mind, making sure that it can't be abused by future governments. Now, Prime Minister Keir Starmer might say, well, then they can just legislate to do whatever they want in the future, and it doesn't really matter what I do now because they'll do what they want with their own majority. And what we would say is these digital systems take a long time to roll out and to build. You know, it will take at least until the end of the parliament to get digital ID up and running. We think it will probably take longer than that. And then you're handing a surveillance system on a silver platter to whoever the next government is. So, you know, it's important when we're trying to convince the Labour government to take a step back and say, every time that they're eroding our right to privacy, our right to protest, our right to free speech, that they're not just thinking about how they use those powers, but how a future government would use those powers, how an opposition that they hate would use those powers, because they're creating an environment where even a party led by a human rights lawyer doesn't care about human rights. That's not a good situation for Britain to be in.
Thank you so much. And we have just hit 7 o'clock, so right on time. We still have lots of questions left to get through, but we will have to respond to those by email. But just to pick up on Fiona's question, who has asked very kindly, how can we support Liberty on a campaign like this? And as Anna mentioned, we're doing so much work behind the scenes and with MPs to work towards our Liberty goals. But also one way that you can help us is by donating to our crowdfunder, which I've popped the link in the chat there. That crowdfunder is to fund all of our work against mass surveillance in the UK. So that encompasses digital IDs and also facial recognition technology and end-to-end encryption, all of our work. We would really, really appreciate if you could donate. Any amount is amazing, or just to share it as well with your friends and family would be fantastic. So thank you so much, Anna. I don't know if you have any final words you'd like to say.
Thank you so much for your really perceptive and interesting questions. You kept me on my toes.
Yeah, the questions were brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that has stayed for the full hour and taken the time out of their evening. As I said, this event has been recorded, so I'll make sure that has been sent around to everyone that signed up, and you can watch that in your own time. And we'll try and get back to people via email for whose questions we weren't able to answer today. So again, just a massive thank you to everyone for joining, and a huge thank you to Anna for taking time to talk us through everything today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye. Have a good evening.